Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories of everyday people and their families. I endeavour to continue publishing episodes ad-free. In order to do so, I would love your support by reviewing my podcast or consider becoming a subscriber for only the cost of a coffee a month. This gives you early access to episodes and also access to bonus episodes, of which at this stage there's over 30. Episode 190, Divorce. William and Jane Malpas divorced in 1884, and it was seen as quite sensational news at the time. William John Malpas was born on the 6th of January 1837 in London. He was the third born of 8 children. He married Jane Hamilton at Balranald, New South Wales on the 30th of July 1861, and the marriage was registered in Swan Hill, Victoria in 1862. Jane had been born at Monara, New South Wales, which is the Ivanhoe district in the southwestern part of the state. She was adopted and brought up by Thomas Reynolds. The married couple lived in Swan Hill and at Killara Station, with William being on the road as a carrier going up and down from Queensland. In February 1869, he is mentioned at a district handicap at Lower Paru, with having a horse named Bacon being part of the race. Says the district handicap of 20 sovereigns for all horses, the property of residents within 100 miles of Peru Inn, a 1.5 mile race. In the Maitland Mercury and Hunter River General Advertiser on the 22nd of July 1869, a small article titled A Fat Beast. As exemplifying the fattening character of the Peru country and its adaptation for cattle breeding, we may mention that Mr. W.G. Malpas of the Peru Inn recently purchased a beast, and when dressed it weighed 1,137 pounds. The animal was by no means the best of the mob. In 1870, William John Malpas is listed in the Burke district at Wannaring, Peru, owning Peru Inn. William made a livelihood by dealing with sheep and by carrying on the business of a carrier, and also had grazing pursuits. In April 1871, William claimed that Jane had an affair with Alexander Falconer Sullivan of Turnapatha Station in New South Wales. In the Maitland Mercury and Hunter River General Advertiser on the 28th of March 1872, a correspondent at Hoodsville, Queensland, border writes, "The only news out this way is the purchase of Kawaroo Station, without stock, being the next but one above the border in Queensland, by Mr. W.J. Malpas, late of Paru Inn, which he intends stocking up with cattle." Jane and William had a son, Herbert Edward, in 1876, who was born in St Kilda, Victoria. And on the 16th of March 1876 at Hobson's Bay, it mentions that the Alexandra SS cleared out for Sydney with W.J. Malpas on board. In 1877, William took a break from the carrier business and settled with his wife and son in St Kilda, and they took a trip to Europe. In the Darling Downs Gazette and General Advertiser at Toowoomba on the 22nd of September 1877, says, Mrs. King and Cunningham report they sold 320 bullocks for Mr. W.J. Malpas of Carnarvon, Paru River. And on the 11th of February 1882, in the Melbourne Leader, it announces the sale of a station. Mr. Charles Brown reports having sold, on account of Mr. W.J. Malpas, his runs in the Warrego and Maranoa districts in Queensland, known as Oblong, Thurlow and Cobram, containing over 227 square miles, to Mr. J. Mackenzie at a satisfactory price. In 1882, William purchased Mount Ridley Estate at Craigieburn in Victoria, and in March 1884, William found out that Jane had had an affair with James Evans, the groom employed on the estate by William. This was said to have occurred between April and June 1883. William claimed that Jane had been in a frequent state of drunkenness, and as a result he wrote a letter to her. From Mount Ridley, Craigieburn, on March the 9th, 1884. To Mrs. Malpas, the discovery of your disgraceful and degraded behaviour renders it for ever to allow you to remain again under my roof, and tomorrow I take steps to seek protection of the law. Having good behaviour, I purpose to provide you for your maintenance, and until other arrangements are made, I enclose you a letter to Mrs. O'Halloran, Prince of Wales Hotel, St Kilda, requesting her to provide you with the necessary accommodation, and for which I hold myself responsible. Likewise, enclosed is a cheque for £5 for contingencies, and suggest for you to be careful how you expend that amount. I may mention that your degradation is known to Dr. Yule, Mr. Whittingham, Mr. Magner, and others, while in this neighbourhood it is common gossip, but as usual in such cases came to my ears. My grief is too great to upbraid you, but implore you on this last occasion. I shall ever address you to pause in your downward career remaining. Your grossly injured husband, Mr. W. Jane Malpas. So divorce proceedings occurred in 1884 against Jane. The co-respondents listed in the divorce were A. F. Sullivan and J. Edwards. On the 15th of July 1884 in the Melbourne Herald, William Malpas wrote a letter to the editor. Sir, your report in yesterday's issue of the application made by me in Malpas versus Malpas to examine 3 witnesses is incorrect. The statement that I had abandoned proceedings against Mr. Sullivan is not the case. What was abandoned was the application to examine the 2 witnesses affecting the evidence as against Mr. Sullivan. The witnesses have consented, at their personal loss and inconvenience, to remain in the colony until after the hearing of my suit, and hence it was not necessary to have their evidence taken. And as regards to those 2 witnesses, the application was abandoned. I have no intention to abandon any proceedings against Mr. Sullivan, but on the contrary, to proceed with my suit against him as quickly as possible. Selborne Chambers, Chancery Lane, Melbourne. On the 23rd of March 1885 in the Melbourne Herald, the Divorce Court, Malpas versus Malpas. The hearing of the suit by William John Malpas, grazier of Craigieburn, for a divorce from his wife Jane Malpas was resumed by Mr. Justice Higginbotham, with a jury of 12 today. This morning, Mr. Malpas, who had been partly examined on Saturday, resumed his evidence. Mr. Malpas is a man of middle height, and having a smooth face and no grey hair, he might easily pass for quite a young man. Seeing him more closely, however, he looks like a man who has suffered great trouble. He gave his evidence well, looking generally in the direction of his counsel, with his hands clasped behind him, only intent apparently on unburdening himself of the painful narrative. Mr. Malpas does not give the appearance of being a man inclined to display of any kind. His dress was neat and showed evidence of good taste, consisting of a dark sack coat and brown trousers of the kind which are in favour just now. Mrs. Malpas was not in court this morning. However, she has been visible in the court since the case started. Mr. Malpas was questioned this morning in reference to an alleged robbery from his home, and he was next asked about the disappearance of liquor from the cellar at Mount Ridley. Owing to the statements made by him by the servants, he examined the cellar and found 6 cases of whisky, a quantity of wine, and spirits were missing. This was in March 1884. He questioned Miss Malpas about the matter. She said perhaps they had been opened, and he then asked by whom the missing liquor had been consumed, and she said it appeared it was by the general public. He said he thought he could guess who the general public were. She replied that some people about the house thought they were very clever, but they'd better mind their own business. Seeing that a scene was imminent, he took his little boy by the hand and let him out. She said, "You can go to the devil and take him with you." He replied, "May God forgive you, Jane, where this will end." He wrote the following letter to his wife, Mount Ridley, Craigieburn, 9th of March 1884. To Mrs. Malpas, the discovery of your disgraceful and degraded behaviour renders it impossible for me to ever allow you again to remain under my roof, and tomorrow I take steps to seek the protection of the law. I propose to provide for your maintenance. Until other arrangements are made, I enclose you a letter to Miss O'Halloran, Prince of Wales Hotel, St Kilda, requesting her to provide the necessary accommodation, and for which I hold myself responsible. I likewise enclose a cheque for £5 for contingencies and suggest that you be careful how you expend that amount. I may mention that your degradation is known by Dr. Yule, Mr. Whittingham, Mr. Weiner, and others in the neighbourhood. It is common gossip, but as usual in such cases, came to my ears the last. My grief is too great to upbraid you, but I implore you, on the last occasion I shall over-address you, to pause in your downward career, remaining your grossly injured husband, W.J. Malpas. To this his wife made no reply. He told her the next day that he meant every word he said, and that she must go from the home. She replied, "I will not go 1 yard. You can do just as you like." He said, "Very well, if this is your determination, I will send for the police." She answered, "Oh, will you indeed?" She went upstairs, came down pretty differently dressed, took a bottle of sherry brandy from the dining room table, took it to her lips and says, "Here's luck to that." He had never written to her or spoke to her since. He was very much agitated. Prior to writing the letter, he saw his wife in the house. He went to his wife's bedroom and found the door locked. He believed to be swooned at the door. When he came to, his wife said, "Do forgive me, pray forgive me." He said, "Keep your hands off." He went to see if the child was all right. The child cried. At this stage, the petitioner became greatly affected, but recovered his composure by a great effort. He went on to say that he at this time knew nothing of the events at Tanapatha, but did so afterwards from Mr. Seravina, Josiah Mitchell, Mr. Webster and others. He saw Flora Bauman 700 miles north of Brisbane at a place called Morven. Subsequently, he employed his proctors. He brought his witnesses to Melbourne prior to September. They included Miss Bauman and Mrs. McGilray. He had seen Edwards since dismissal at a place called Darrawheat Gum on the Deep Creek in the Macedon Ranges. He went there in consequence of a telegram received from Mr. Wright, who he saw there when he went there. He took the necessary papers in the divorce suit, but did not think that they were signed by the master in equity. He saw Edwards at a weatherboard shanty. He was away when he got there, and the petitioner watched all night. In the morning, he heard that Edwards had arrived and was watching the place. A man named Keane was also there. He saw Wright give Edwards some papers, and he heard Edwards say something to Wright and Keane. The petitioner said he'd heard no more of the evidence. He might say generally that after Edwards entered his service, his wife's conduct was variable and violent. His wife was consistently chewing cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon and ginger and raw onions during the latter part of their married life. Mr. Reynolds, whose adopted daughter his wife was, did not object to his marrying her. He received £600 under Mr. Reynolds's will. He did not strike his wife 6 months after marriage. He did not pull his wife out of bed and strike her and bang her against the wall. He used to travel into the back country selling things, Crimean shirts. His wife made the shirts most industriously. At Walloo Bend, where he lived in 1864, he lived in a house with wooden walls and a tarpaulin roof. His wife made shirts there also. Did she work hard and industriously and affectionately for you? And the petitioner said always. After he got to Warnering and before the public house was open, he did not strike her face. Dr. Madden asked, "Did you strike her in the head with your clenched fist, knock her violently down and pull her hair at Warnering?" "Never, nor anywhere else." "Were there any women in the place beyond a black woman?" The petitioner, Mrs. Elizabeth Hart, she came just before so many rooms were finished for which he obtained a licence. The black woman did the ordinary service of white servants. "Did not your wife for 2 years do all the cooking for 15 men?" And he said, "No, there was a man cook." "When did he come?" "A few weeks after we went there. Richard Dougal was one of the cooks. He was there on and off until we left Paru. Another was O'Toole." He said, "We engaged men and dismissed them every week. If a man gets drunk, we sack him." "Was there a white woman within 50 miles of Warnering?" "There was a married couple about 15 miles away." "You had known Mr. Sullivan for many years?" The petitioner said, "He was a man I was always pleased to see and I trusted him." He did not recollect an allusion being made to the fact of his wife and Mr. Sullivan being bushed. In consequence of something he heard, he spoke to his wife. He was angry at her leaving the house in his absence. She regretted it and said that she would not do it again, but she did not think that there was much harm and others were there. "Did she not tell you distinctly every detail of what happened?" He said, "No." He said, "Do you swear that?" He said, "I swear that." "What did she say?" "I had a conversation with her. She said she did not know that there was any great harm in it and that Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. McGilray and Flora were going and that she went. I forgave her." "Why did you not tell us that on Saturday?" And he said, "I answered the questions put to me." "Did you not think it would be fair to your wife that the jury would know the conversation with your wife?" And he said, "I never thought about it. When he went away, he left William Serivina in charge of the place." "Do you think it was a tremendous excess of propriety for your wife to want to get away from the witnesses where she was and go on a picnic?" "I think for my wife to go visiting a bachelor in my absence was an unpardonable act. She might have waited for a more suitable occasion." "Were the Serivinas and Mitchells bachelors?" And the petitioner said yes. "And you trusted them as well as Sullivan?" "Yes." "At this time you had prospered?" And the petitioner said yes. "Have you had much experience of women?" The petitioner said, "I had a mother and sisters." Do you think there was any impropriety in your wife wishing to give up the hotel and take up a station, giving up the rough work? There was no rough work at Wainwaring. Dr. Madden asked, do you like city life better than life in the bush? And the petitioner said, bush life has a charm for me. The petitioner denied that on the occasion on a visit to Sydney he gave his wife a blow which blackened her eyes, that they were in consequence bound up, and that he explained that it was caused by her falling out of the buggy. He had never assaulted his wife in his life. His Honour asked, never assaulted your wife in your life? And the petitioner said, never. Mr. Madden asked the petitioner whether he had a diary in 1875. And the petitioner said, my wife took all my diaries. When my wife left, she took her boxes, and I have never seen my diaries since. Dr. Madden said, and therefore you come to the conclusion that she took them. The petitioner said, I am sure she did. Dr. Madden asked, the boy who has been alluded to lives with you? The petitioner said, yes, and I hope he always will. Dr. Madden said, was it by your instruction that your counsel was instructed to proclaim him illegitimate? Mr. Purvis said, I did not do anything of the kind. His Honour said he should tell the jury that the evidence did not give indirectly throw any doubt on the legitimacy of the child. On the 24th of March 1885 in the Echuca Riverine Herald, in the divorce court on Saturday the 21st of March, Malpas versus Malpas. Hearing of this divorce petition was resumed. The co-respondent Edwards did not appear. John Malpas, the petitioner, stated he married the respondent in 1861 after a courtship of a few months. He'd known her for some years prior to the marriage when she was in the habit of travelling between Sandhurst, that is now Bendigo, and Swan Hill in a coach of which he was the driver. For 12 months after their marriage, they resided at Swan Hill, and he continued driving the coach. Subsequently, he purchased sheep and travelled with them, and later bought a station on the Darling. In 1864, he built a residence at Walloo Bend on the Darling, and in the following year he became a squatter. Flora Sarivanor lived with them in 1866 and 1867, her brothers being in the petitioner's employment as overseers. He was on intimate terms with Sullivan, who frequently stayed at the station as a guest. The conduct of the respondent was irreproachable for some years, but on one occasion, after he'd been away from the station, she told him that Sullivan had been there in his absence, and after that she seemed discontented. He travelled with the respondent through different colonies, and afterwards put the respondent on board a steamer at Echuca for Bourke. At Echuca he found Sullivan in the same hotel with the respondent. On the 18th of December 1875, the respondent gave birth to her first child, though they'd been married for 15 years. The birth took place at St Kilda. About 2 months after the birth, he saw Sullivan in the street in front of the house. Sullivan told the petitioner he thought he was away at the station. On 2 occasions while at St Kilda, the respondent went for a drive with Sullivan with the petitioner's consent. The co-respondent James Edwards was engaged by the petitioner in 1882 as a labourer about the house, and in the commencement of the following year he was made groom. In February 1883, Edwards was found drunk and incapable, and the petitioner ordered him to be dismissed, but at the request of the respondent, the order of dismissal was cancelled. On the 10th of April, he received a letter from the respondent and consequently went to the station on the following day. She then informed him that the night before, a man had been in the house and taken away a quantity of jewellery and other valuables. On one occasion, when he returned home, he found the respondent drunk, and he thought that she was taking leave of her senses. And a week later, on the 31st of March 1885 in the Melbourne Herald, today's proceedings. The examination of Mrs. Jane Malpas, the respondent, was resumed. She said, it is true that Mr. Sullivan was at my husband's hotel at Walnaring and was in the visiting parlour with me. It is not true, as alleged by Flora Sarivana, that Mr. Sullivan came late to the room. It is untrue that Flora and others left Mr. Sullivan and myself in the room and got into the buggy. It is untrue that the others waited for a long time until we did the same. I didn't realise that they were waiting at all. From first to last there was no improper familiarity between Sullivan and myself. Mr. Malpas was away at that time in Adelaide. I think he returned about the time he said he would. When he did return, I told him of our visit to Mr. Webster's place. I did so almost immediately after that we went to his place. Mr. Malpas knew of this invitation and did not make any objection to it. I told him we had a very pleasant outing and enjoyed it very much. I do not recall telling him anything else. I did not tell him that little cocky Sullivan had been at the hotel, as I never sullied him by that name, but I told him that Mr. Sullivan had been there. There were no disagreements between us after that. My behaviour was just the same as usual. I remember many complaints by him. The complaints were general. He was dissatisfied. I wished him to sell the house. I had nearly all the work to do myself, and I found it beyond my strength. Once, after we lived at Kalwaru, Mr. Sullivan called when passing and had lunch. He stayed 2 to 3 hours. I never went from Kalwaru to Sullivan Station. It was not at Mr. Sullivan's suggestion that I went to Webster's. I was not under the influence of drink at Walnaring or Kalwaru. Josiah Saravana's statement is untrue. It is very untrue that I challenged him to a drink, saying I could drink him alone blind. He was a dirty fellow and lived with a black. I never drank with him. I don't remember that I was in any condition like a sort of madness. It is untrue that I told Saravana that he was not to come into my room where I was. He was never in my bedroom in his life. At this stage, Mrs. Malpas became somewhat affected. There is not a particle of truth in his statements. Every word he says is untrue. We looked upon him more as a blackfellow than a white man. I travelled with my husband to Port Stephen. On the way, he gave me a pair of black eyes. I was teasing him and he got angry and struck me between the eyes with his fist, producing a pair of black eyes. We stopped at a hotel. My eyes were black when we were there, and I made the excuse that I'd fallen out of the trap. My eyes were covered with a handkerchief. I remained there about 6 weeks afterwards. From there, we were staying at Kalwaru. During this visit, I was in health. I had been unhappy for many years. I was not unwilling to return to the station, but I did prefer living in town, as my life in the country was so rough and unpleasant. At Kalwaru, I sometimes had a man cook, but very often did the cooking. I also did the other household work. It is untrue that I misconducted myself with a stockman named James O'Connor. I recollect such a man. He was there for 12 months or more altogether, in the middle of the time we were there. I recollect a journey to Bourke, but it is untrue that my husband gave me a letter to the hotel keeper there. I record the hotel keeper coming to the steamer and stating that he had received a letter from my husband asking him to make me comfortable. He said the house was full owing to the annual race meeting, and he was afraid he could not let me have a comfortable room. I remained on the steamer. I recollect seeing Mr. Sullivan at Bourke. He came to the steamer with Mr. Matthew O'Shannessy. Mr. Malpas had not then arrived. I did not see Mr. Sullivan apart from when he was with the other gentlemen, and I did not go to the races there. I don't know whether Mr. Malpas did. I was present at an interview in a cottage in the township between my husband and Mr. Sullivan. My husband asked Mr. Sullivan if he would mind my riding in his trap, as he would have a lot of luggage to take down himself. Mr. Sullivan said with pleasure, and that he would be pleased to help in any way. That is the conversation I recollect. I rode with Mr. Sullivan in the buggy. I fancy my husband went by spring cart. At the close of each day we camped out. The distance between Bourke and Kalwaru is 140 miles. The trap I was in often drove out of sight of that in which Mr. Malpas was, but we were never out of sight of O'Donnell's trap. I did not abuse my husband for refusing to allow me to go to Brindon Yallock, nor was I angry with him. Our child was born. I recollect Sullivan coming to our house in St Kilda 2 months after the birth of my child. He came by my husband's invitation. My husband told me on Saturday that he had asked Mr. Sullivan to come on the Sunday. As I was sitting at the window, I saw Mr. Sullivan and told my husband that I saw him, and he came in. Mr. Sullivan saw the baby and said that it was a wonderful child. I did not see Mr. Sullivan at all during the year of 1875. We went to England in 1878 and remained there for 18 months. There was an unpleasantness between us there. There were great words between us, and Mr. Malpas said he would get a separation. Upon our return, we again lived at Marion Cottage in St Kilda. Whilst there, Mr. Malpas used acts of violence on me on several occasions. About 6 months after our return, he pushed me out of a room with a tray full of crockery and shut the door. He pushed me out violently so all the crockery fell. William Sarevana was present on that occasion. On one occasion he boxed my ears and knocked my head against the wall in the bedroom. I left the room and was seen by Mrs. Ellis. Once he boxed my ears violently in the sitting room, in a room full of people, including Mr. and Mrs. Staper, Captain Dorwood, Mr. and Mrs. Device, and others. He pushed me violently over the sofa. The child was crying in the bedroom. My husband would go and get him, and when I waited for him to give him to me, he pushed and slapped the child. My husband was always of a harsh nature and used to swear. She recalled Mount Ridley being purchased by her husband. When we took possession of the place, it was in a very dilapidated, dirty state. There was an old man named Andrew Keane looking after the place, and he continued in my husband's service. There were no other servants, and for a fortnight I did the cooking and household work until we had got a little girl from the township. It was 6 weeks or 2 months afterwards before anyone was obtained. I did the active work. There were 15 or 20 men working about the home. They used to dine in the laundry and I cooked for them, and the little girl waited on them. I still did work, but I complained to my husband that the work was too hard and he got a man to cook. I had a governess named Miss Christie. I recollect James Edwards, who at first was a general servant. Sometimes afterwards he was made groom, but I don't remember when. It was not at my expressed intention or desire that Edwards was engaged as groom. He was engaged at my husband's suggestion. I said it was a great mistake to engage a labouring man as a groom. I preferred an older man and suggested one. However, my husband engaged him. When Edwards was made groom, my husband got a bedstead and bedding and asked me to have it put up in the groom's room. During the time Edwards was there, we sometimes had 2 horses in the stable and sometimes 3, and I used to go infrequently to the stable, being fond of horses. The servant girls and lady visitors also used to visit the stables. There was a hayloft in which we used to read and chat. By we, I mean any of the lady visitors. The girls were on very friendly terms with Edwards, and he was very kind and thoughtful to them. The 2 parties had a quarrel in 1883, and the respondent complained that the coldness on the part of her husband made her unhappy, and she commenced to drink. On the 24th of April 1885 in the Melbourne Age, the case was continued in the Supreme Court yesterday. His Honour said he did not remember any case which seemed to him to have more of the character of a family tragedy than this. Fortunately, there was only one child, so that in that respect the disastrous consequences of separation between man and wife would not be so severe as they might otherwise be. Here were 2 persons married about 24 years ago, both of them persons who had lived a life of fondness towards each other and with deserved and mutual confidence in one another. Just at the time when their prosperity was at its height, and there was every prospect of a happy life, this calamity occurred. The respondent was evidently a woman of a merry and happy nature, and she had lived a life of great hardship, helping her husband in his labours and struggles. When, however, their labours had practically ceased and they had attained affluence, the respondent commenced to give way to the deadly habit of drink. Referring to the statement made by the petitioner to Mrs. Watson to the effect that the respondent was suffering from a loathsome disease, His Honour pointed out that there was not a tittle of evidence to support it. The petitioner had also made a vague hint as to the respondent having been seen going into a house of assignation with Edwards, but no evidence was given of that charge. When the petitioner wrote to the respondent stating that her dishonourable conduct was known, he had no evidence against her. He appeared to have been animated by almost a perverted spirit of animosity towards the respondent. It was an unhappy concomitant of trials such as this that the names of persons unconnected with the case were dragged into court and their family affairs made public. What did the jury think of the reasons for dragging the names of Mr. and Mrs. Watson before the court in connection with this charge? What also did they think of the charge brought by the petitioner against Sullivan, accusing him of being the father of the child? The accusation could have been disproved at any time, but this unhappy man refused to have his mind relieved of its suspicion, though Sullivan's innocence in that respect had been proved to demonstration. The first question to which he wished to draw the attention of the jury was, did the respondent commit adultery with Sullivan in the month of March 1871? On this point, the evidence of 7 witnesses had to be considered. In connection with the Turnapather incident, it has been put before the petitioner that the journey to Turnapather was concocted. Neither the circumstances of the journey favour the theory that adultery was intended, as Mrs. McGilwray's evidence showed that the respondent invited her to go into the house with Sullivan, which was an unlikely thing for the respondent to do if the journey was designed for the purpose of committing adultery. The buggy driven by Sullivan and containing himself and the respondent overshot the station, although Sullivan was a most expert bushman. On their return to the station, they were joked about having missed their way, some unpleasantness being caused by Mrs. McGilwray suggesting that they had an object in losing themselves. The evidence of Webster as to what took place that night was unsatisfactory, as the suggestion that Sullivan was creeping into the adjoining room was founded on the remains of a dream, and his waking moments the witness was not sure whether the circumstance took place or not. If that suggestion, founded as it was in a dream, had not been put into the minds of the jury, the evidence of this witness would be in favour of the respondent. The evidence of Mrs. McGilwray as to what occurred during the early part of the evening was that Sullivan entered the room where the women were lying and committed adultery with the respondent. But her testimony showed that the act, if committed at all, must have taken place in the space of 2 minutes, during the time in which Flora Bauman was absent from the room. Her statement as to Sullivan entering the room did not coincide with that of Webster, who alleged that Sullivan yielded to his remonstrance and did not enter the room at the early part of the night. The effect of the evidence of these two females was in conflict not only with the evidence of Webster on that all-important point of Sullivan going into the room at all, but also in opposition to the direct denial of the respondent and Sullivan. In such cases, it was for the jury to weigh the possibilities. Two ladies asserted that certain acts were done which clearly pointed to adultery. They could not believe that if Sullivan went into the room on that night, he did so for any other purpose than to commit adultery, and that he did commit it. They were asked on one hand to say that it was highly improbable that this could have been done. It was said that if adultery was attempted, both these ladies would certainly have remonstrated against it, done in their presence. Twice, according to them, it was done in their presence, once in open day. If the respondent committed adultery at that time, she must have been absolutely without fear or care of consequences. Was that condition of mind consistent with the fact that the respondent quarrelled with Mrs. McGilwray for imputing improper motives to her and Sullivan? It was open for the jury to refuse to accept the testimony of witnesses who had taken part in the adulterous proceedings and who might not be entirely innocent themselves. A question has been asked as to what motive these witnesses could have had in making false statements, but it must be remembered that in all these cases, influence went a long way. There was this report in circulation about the country as to the respondent and Sullivan being lost in the bush. Could that be the origin of this whole story? And could not the testimony of these two ladies have grown out of it by a process of exaggeration? He would now invite the attention of the jury to the evidence given in support of the charges of adultery alleged to have been committed in the months of April, May and June 1883. In passing, however, he referred to the Burke incident as showing the eagerness of the petitioner's mind to clutch everything that would feed his suspicions. The evidence in relation to the second charge extended over a period from June 1882 to the 8th of March 1884. In regard to this, two classes of testimony had been offered, that which pointed directly to the commission of adultery and that which only pointed inferentially to the offence. His Honour had faith in Edwards's alleged confession. The evidence of Sampson pointed directly to the fact that adultery had been committed, and if they placed their reliance upon it, there was no escape. He stated that he went to Mount Ridley on the 19th of May 1883, and he noticed that the respondent was on very intimate terms with the groom Edwards. On one occasion during his stay, he saw the respondent sitting on Edwards' knee in a room attached to the stable. He had his arms around her waist and her arms were about his neck. The presumption to be drawn from that incident was either that adultery had been committed or was about to be committed. Another witness, George Munro, stated that he was employed at Mount Ridley at the beginning of 1883. In May of that year, he went to the stable and found the respondent and Edwards there. Edwards had his arm around her neck, and on another occasion he saw them in a similar position near a hedge and also observed Edwards kissing her. Nothing was elicited in cross-examination that would tend to throw discredit upon the character of this witness, though it was suggested that the influence of the petitioner was provable in the case of all of his witnesses. It was not His Honour's duty to express any opinion as to whether that influence had been improperly exhorted or not, as that was a question entirely for the jury. There was another branch of evidence which, though not direct, embraced a large number of incidents which, if believed, would point with more or less strength to the fact of adultery. For instance, there was an assertion that the respondent had pinned flowers in Edward's coat as well as placing them in his bedroom. A large mass of evidence had been given on other incidents which seemed to favour the theory of adultery, though many of them were quite consistent with the respondent's innocence. In relation to the incidents which were not easily reconcilable with her innocence, it was suggested that the witnesses were not speaking the truth. but he thought no successful attempt had been made to found adverse comment on the demeanour of these witnesses in the box. The fact that the respondent was in the habit of frequenting the stables might be explained by her admitted fondness for horses, but if the allegations as to her drunkenness were sustained, what could they expect would result from her going to the stable where the groom Edwards was employed? It was, however, difficult to imagine that she could have appeared to be sober for so many years without causing suspicion to the petitioner, and many witnesses deposed her to have sober habits up to recent date. Much evidence has been given to show that of late she had given away to drink, and this was borne out of the respondent's own confession. The third question which the jury had to decide was whether the petitioner had been guilty of cruelty, and His Honour read the evidence which had been given in support of this contention. When a man sought a dissolution of marriage on the grounds of his wife's adultery to be successful, he had to go into court with clean hands. Still, there should be discretionary power with the court in this matter, and there were various grounds on which the court might use their discretion. Mr. Malpas was a man who had apparently led an honourable life, a life of industry by which he had prospered, and outside this trial there was not a blot on the character of either party. Up until the 9th of March, when the separation took place, the petitioner appeared to have done his duty to his wife, but after that date, his conduct was certainly open to query. He then interfered with the evidence in a most suspicious way, and his whole conduct after this time was unreasonable and unjust. Cruelly and weakly he charged his wife with misconduct, and had endeavoured to poison Mrs. Watson's mind against his wife. Mrs. Watson had stated that Mr. Malpas said to her that his wife had suffered from a loathsome disease and had endeavoured to prejudice other persons. His Honour thought, however, a great deal of allowance should be made for the petitioner's conduct owing to his state of mind. In reference to the paternity of the child, His Honour said that it had been proved to demonstration that Sullivan could not possibly have been the father. It was shown that Mr. Malpas had been harsh, but this did not excuse drunkenness. So the case was adjourned, where the jury would retire to consider their verdict. So basically, with the testimonies, particularly of William Malpas and Jane Malpas, the judge is considering whether William Malpas had basically paid off his employees in order to fabricate situations where infidelity could be proven. And then Jane Malpas, on the other hand, refuted all of the statements that William Malpas made. And on the 24th of April 1885, in the Ballarat Star, it stated that the case had been settled the day before. They found for petitioner on every count. On the first, in which the co-respondent is Sullivan, by 10-2, and on the issue alleging adultery with Edwards, the decision was unanimous. The jury also unanimously agreed that the petitioner had not been guilty of cruelty to the respondent. The verdict gave general surprise, as such a result was scarcely anticipated. The co-respondent Sullivan will have to bear the cost incurred by himself and the respondent. On the 18th of March 1886, in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, it says the Malpas divorce case in Melbourne. The divorce suit of Malpas versus Malpas was again brought before the Supreme Court today, when a motion was made on behalf of the petitioner, the co-respondent, Arthur F. Sullivan. He struck out of the suit and proceedings discontinued against him. The application was granted. An application to have the decree nisi made absolute as regards the co-respondent Edwards was granted. The permanent alimony to the respondent was fixed at £234 per annum for life, and it was finally arranged that the allowance would be £4 10 shillings a week. On the 22nd of September 1886, in the Sydney Morning Herald, it announced overland passenger traffic from Albury to Sydney, W.J. Malpas. A little over a year later again, the overland passenger traffic from Albury to Melbourne by express, W.J. Malpas. And 4 months later, in the Brisbane Queenslander, on the 10th of March 1888, Wallangarra, the following passengers are travelling by express train to Sydney, W.J. Malpas. And then 2 months later, on the 2nd of May 1888, overland passengers from Queensland to Sydney, again W.J. Malpas. On the 22nd of January 1889, in the Sydney Australian Star, Squatter and Butcher. In Melbourne, George Davies Butcher, charged with maliciously assaulting W.J. Malpas Squatter, was brought up at the City Court today and remanded to the Sandridge Police Court. Mr. Malpas's broken fingers are progressing favourably. It outlined how a serious assault case occurred on the excursion steamer Ozone that proceeded down Hobson's Bay on the 20th of January. A dispute occurred about the possession of a chair between W.J. Malpas, a squatter, well known in connection with the Malpas divorce case, and George Davis, a butcher of Lygon Street, Carlton, when a struggle ensued during which Malpas was violently assaulted, 2 of his fingers being badly broken. On 25th of April 1890 in the Melbourne Herald, from Broken Hill, W.J. Malpas and Company, stockbrokers, Elizabeth Street. And in 1890, it lists in Crown Lands at the county of Ullarara, parish of Wainering. It mentions how William John Malpas had 40 acres. In 1896, in the Registrar's General's office in Sydney, there was a trademark that was registered. It's hereby notified that William John Malpas, trading as J.S. Corden and Company of North Melbourne in Victoria, had a trademark for a label or device containing the representation of a bull's head in double circles, and above this in scroll bearing the name of J.S. Corden and Company, and below a distinctive word or name titled Refrigerine. Courtney Street, North Melbourne, near Metropolitan Meat Market. And William John Malpas died on the 1st of April 1897 in Melbourne, aged 60. He's buried in the Melbourne Cemetery, and it states that he was the son of the late Edward Malpas of London and father of Herbert Edward Malpas. And it announced in the papers the death of William Malpas on the 2nd of April 1897 in the Sydney Australian Star. Death of Mr. W.J. Malpas in Melbourne. Mr. W.J. Malpas, well known of late years on the Melbourne Stock Exchange, but previously a squatter in a large way and plaintiff in the famous Malpas versus Malpas divorce suit, died suddenly at the Stock Exchange Club this morning. The deceased gentleman had not been in the best of health for some time past, but when pressed to see, a medical man refused absolutely. However, some time back a doctor examined him and found his heart affected. To this, the cause of death was attributed. A post-mortem examination was held, and the results showed that the death was due to disease of the kidneys and failure of the heart's action, and no inquest will be held. Some family trees have Jane Malpas's death recorded, however there is no formal record attached to this. The 8th of December 1885, and her death was in Wimmera, Victoria, which means she would have been 38 years old. And a little on his son, Herbert Edward. Well, as mentioned, he was born on the 21st of March 1876 in St Kilda. Herbert married May Brown, known as Molly, on the 21st of November 1900 in Sydney. Molly had been born in Hamilton, Victoria. They had a daughter, Edna Thelma Malpas, in Sydney on the 25th of September 1901. Edna married Cecil Eric Wheaton in January 1925 in Sydney and died in February 1958 in Sydney, aged 56. And in the Sydney Evening News on the 10th of September 1908, baby's picture. Molly or May Malpas, formerly Brown, petitioned for a dissolution of her marriage with Herbert Edward Malpas on the grounds of desertion. The petitioner, who was represented by Mr. Bertram, said she married the respondent in November 1900 in Sydney, according to Independent Presbyterian Rights. He was a commercial traveller whom she'd known in Melbourne for 2 years before. They went to live at Darlington Point, where they remained for 15 months, after which they moved into the Hotel Columbia, of which her husband became the licensee. About 2 months after they entered the hotel, the respondent commenced drinking, and she had occasion to speak to him about certain women. They subsequently sold out of the hotel, and she went to reside with friends at Dowling Street in Moore Park. She had been there about a fortnight when she heard the respondent had gone to New Zealand. From Wellington, she received a letter asking her to remain in Sydney until he returned to her. She replied to that and received another letter in which he asked for their child's portrait. She sent it but received no reply. Afterwards she wrote him several letters, but they were returned unclaimed. The letters she had destroyed. She last saw her husband in April 1903. Before they left the hotel, 2 women came there and asked for the respondent, who was out. She afterwards spoke to him about visiting a certain house in Dowling Street, but she forgave him. Later she heard that he was still visiting the house, and she again spoke to him about it. He denied it at first, but afterwards admitted it. A decree nisi was granted to be moved to absolute in 6 months. Herbert had a child with Edith Josephine Manson on the 17th of March 1909, and this child was born at St Joseph's Home of Compassion in Island Bay, Wellington, New Zealand. The child was called Juanita Elizabeth Manson, known as Nita. Edith was 19 and Herbert 33 when she was born. Juanita married William Brinfield in 1928, and they had 5 children. Nita died in 2004 in Wellington, New Zealand, aged 94. Herbert then went on to marry Ada Louisa Fabling in Wellington, New Zealand in 1911. They had 2 children, Herbert Jr. in 1912 and Maud in 1915. Herbert Jr. was known as Herbert Warrinath Tapui Malpas, known as Warren, and he married Edna Watu in 1945 and they had 5 children together. Warren died on the 9th of May 1977 at Heratunga in New Zealand, aged 64. The other child, Maud, married Athol Burns and she died in New Zealand in 1988 at the age of 73. And it says on the 13th of March 1945 at her residence, 24 Charleston Avenue, Lower Hutt, Ada Louise Malpas, loving mother of Warren and Maud, very deeply mourned, privately cremated. And Herbert died on the 1st of November 1946 in Wellington, New Zealand, aged 70. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch.